Hello, hello. We're live. Episode 3, based on a true story podcast. Uh, this is another war movie that's not intentional, but if you searched on movies that are based on a true story that have books associated with them, you'd see that war movies or war stories make up a huge percentage of the genre, if you will. The book we're talking about today is The Outpost, An Untold Story of American Valor by Jake Tapper. Yes, that Jake Tapper. The book came out in 2012. The movie is simply called The Outpost, which came out in 2019. This is not a star-studded cast, unlike the last episode about Black Hawk Down. But Orlando Bloom is in this one too, and spoiler, doesn't last long again. The movie also has Scott Eastwood in a major role, and he's great in it. He plays a real soldier, Clint, I kid you not, Romatia. That's the character's name, this real soldier's name. This story is, more of a Greek tragedy than a traditional war movie. It's an American war story where the American military is the protagonist, demonstrating both excessive pride and misjudgment, if you will. That's why I come up with the Greek tragedy analog. Basically, in an attempt to open these operating bases in this small square in northeastern Afghanistan on the border of Pakistan, all hell breaks loose. It's another story about chaos. This one a little bit self-inflicted just by the choice of the location. So the book starts in 2006. It's in Afghanistan, which is about the size of Texas, with a population of around 44 million people. But again, the whole story is in this small square in the northeastern corner of the country, if you looked at it in a map. The movie itself is really just the last 100 pages of a 600-page book, which is my opportunity, right, as the host of this podcast. The story is about combat outpost Keating, as it would become known after the outpost's leader at the time, Keating, played by Orlando Bloom, is killed. Has to do with just all the equipment not being right for the environment, whether it's trucks or roads, and basically the outpost is in a mountain valley at the lowest possible point, surrounded by unimaginably steep and high mountains. If you know anything about warfare, not that I know a lot, but even someone like me knows that the enemy has an advantage when they have the high point relative to the enemy, which they do throughout this story. So a brief history, as I like to do to set up the actual podcast, the history of the Afghanistan war. So we invaded Afghanistan, the U.S. did, soon after September 11, 2001, the attack on the World Trade Center, like a month later. And the goal, and this is probably hindsight on my part, is to remove the Taliban, punish al-Qaeda, and install a U.S.-friendly and democratic government in the form of Karzai, the first president. What happens soon after we initiate attack is bin Laden escapes. And part of our nation-building efforts that follow the so-called victory of chasing Taliban out of the country, part of the reconstruction effort include these provincial reconstruction teams, or PRTs. Now, as early as May 2003, Rumsfeld declared the major combat operations over. And now we're into nation building and installing a friendly government. As you know, NATO took over. We only had 8,000 troops in Afghanistan at the time, but this war lasts for 20 years. That's how long we're in country. Again, the historical note that comes up in the first 500 pages of the book, not reflected in the movie. 2003, so 2 years after we attack Afghanistan and chase the Taliban out, is the same year that Bush initiates war in Iraq. And in an opinion that comes up a few times in the book, not just the author's opinion, but quotes from family members, quotes from, I believe, soldiers, but family members that killed in action in this story, it can is that the Iraq War consumed majority of the resources of the U.S. military starting in 2003, which means less for Afghanistan, but we're still there. So a lot of the troubles that haunted this particular outpost would be due to the lack of resources. They just needed more people, more troops on the ground. And again, for the record, the story starts in 2006. So 3 years after Rumsfeld's announcement, 3 years after we invade Iraq, and the war in Afghanistan goes 20 years until 2021. That's the background. Now, these PRTs, what's the purpose of these PRTs generally? Again, overall, this one's called Outpost Keating, and it's near the Pakistan border. There's winning hearts and minds, partnering with the locals, economic development. Oh, we're going to build your roads. We're going to bring in power and fresh water. And because the war ramped up again in Afghanistan, one of the goals was to stop the flow of weapons and soldiers coming in from Pakistan to fight in Afghanistan. And I just want to let the emphasis on Pakistan sink in for a moment, because as I was done reading the book and watching the movie, it struck me that I'd never remember hearing about Pakistan being the enemy or responsible for so much of our troubles in Afghanistan during our time there, as I feel like I believe now after having read the story. So again, the book starts in 2006. And it's just with a mission to set up this one base. Now, unfortunately, the story also starts off with a helicopter crash. No fighting involved, just an inadequate landing pad, kills 10 soldiers right out of the gate. And that's again, some of the Greek tragedy part of this is number of deaths that take place just trying to operate in this region, before a bullet is fired. And I had this memory in reading this. My first legal job when I was 16, probably around 1983, was at Burger King. I say legal, the first time I was on the books and paying taxes and getting a W-2. And if you think about 1980s, there were a lot of, if you're working for a guy who was in his mid-30s, there was a good chance he was a Vietnam vet. And that was the case for me at Burger King. My manager, Bob, is his real name. He always talked about being a can-do guy. Like I ask you to do something, you just say, yep, I can do it. You don't hem and haw or hedge it. You just say, I can do it. And then you figure out how to do it. Bob was Special Forces, by the way. He told me a lot of Vietnam War stories. And so I understood where his perspective came from. So everyone that visits this outpost, becomes Outpost Keating, says WTF. Like they come in and they're just shaking their heads. What are we doing here? It's literally within a narrow valley at the base of impossibly steep mountains. The roads are too narrow and crappy for our U.S. military-grade Humvees, right, which are not built for this environment. And it just turns into one kind of tragedy over another. It always blows my mind, the danger of just operating and training as a soldier for combat, the number of deaths that the military experiences just in getting ready to fight. So initially it's called Camp Kamdesh, if you ever hear that name. And they're trying to meet with locals, win hearts and minds. Within the U.S. little base there, they have ANA members, the Afghan National Army, who continue, in my mind, to be of suspect loyalty and skill. The Taliban sneaks in every once in a while, takes pop shots at the soldiers in the base. They have the higher ground. They disappear very easily. They will threaten and outright kill locals for working with the Americans. At one point in the story, there's a local elder, Yumas, who was kidnapped by HIG, which I don't know the Arabic translation. Basically, it's the Party of Islam. And they killed and mutilated Yumas and left his mutilated corpse for everyone to see. And that caused the outpost leader, again, Keating, while he was still alive, he wrote his dad something like, guess what? We created, trained, and equipped HIG. They were Northern Afghanistan's heroes of the Russian war and had heavy ties to the CIA. And the other word you keep hearing in these letters from the soldiers writing back to their families is the word futility. And it keeps coming up again and again. And this is 2006, okay? Just like in Black Hawk Down, RPGs are a big part of the story. The base gets hit with rifle fire and RPGs 3 times a week. In defending themselves, a local kid in Afghani gets killed. The U.S. pays, $3,000 in a condolence fee. That's kind of, they had rules for it, and it happens, but not winning any hearts or minds when that happens. But it's not blaming anybody. It was just, the kids could be wandering around in the goat trails, where the soldiers are yards to the left or right shooting at us, and the U.S. soldiers shoot back. It's about this point in the story, in the book, not in the movie, that Keating, the leader, offers to drive a truck. It's a crappy job. He does it himself. Drives one of their big trucks back to another outpost because that outpost needs it, and their outpost supposedly doesn't. He dies in the crash just as the truck, which is too wide for the road, hits a soft edge and literally rolls off a cliff. Just tragic. The base gets named for him. That's when he becomes Combat Outpost Keating. Interesting note, I don't know what to make of it. It's clear in 2007, so the second year that this book is covering the information, the history of this outpost. It's in 2007, it becomes clear to the soldiers there that the insurgents are becoming better trained and better armed than in 2006. Like, they could see their game completely going up, whatever that's worth. Another Vietnam comparison that I made last week about Black Hawk Down is the insurgents are all Al-Qaeda from Pakistan, but clearly locals are also involved, kind of playing both sides, and there's no way for the U.S. troops to know who's screwing them over, who their friends are, who they can count on, who they can't. And that's just mind-numbingly frustrating, as you can imagine, given what their mission is. Halfway through the book, by the way, I also start thinking about this economic concept called the sunk cost fallacy. It comes up in the investing world all the time. I think it's appropriate here. It's like a psychological dynamic. It's here's a definition off the internet: the phenomenon whereby a person is reluctant to abandon a strategy or course of action because they have invested heavily in it, even when it is clear that abandonment would be more beneficial. So that's a cognitive bias, if you will. And you hear that time and time again. Like, if you were doing some blank paper thinking, I think a year into this, if you could close your eyes as a leader, pretend that this base didn't exist, you would not open it. But here it is. They stayed and they invested without additional resources, really. They just kind of had to make do in that environment. So tension continues to build for resources on that point between Iraq and Afghanistan, the latter, Afghanistan, kind of being the stepchild in the Middle Eastern war zone. So Obama takes over. This is just a note, kind of in election 2008, 2009. He takes over. He gets briefed and quickly concludes, like, there's no strategy that anyone could articulate or achieve in Afghanistan generally, in this region specifically. So May 2009, just a few months later, the decision is made to close 3 bases in the Nuristan province, where this outpost Keating is located. But there's another national election taking place in August 20. So we already have Karzai in there. Now they're trying to have a democratic election. It's going to take place on August 20. So decision is made in May to close the bases, but they don't want to run out of there before the election. So there's a decision not to withdraw anybody before then. And eventually, by the way, this gets pushed off again until October. And that process, when they keep rolling over what seems to be inevitable and intelligent, the closure of these bases and the removal of the soldiers, I kept thinking about the story. I probably heard about it in the book All Quiet in the Western Front, and that movie, which is maybe something I should do, which was the armistice signing early in the morning of November 11, 1918. But they decided, for bizarre reasons, that it wouldn't take effect until 11 a.m. that day. And I always think of all the deaths, and it's part of the story in All Quiet in the Western Front. You've probably seen it, but it was all over the war zone. There's, by one estimate, there's like 10,000 more soldiers died, but any one of them was one too many, right? Once you've ended the war, it's just mind numbing to think about those losses. So the election takes place October 3, 2009 is basically the battle that the movie covers. Problem is, word of the base closure got out in advance, something they fought tooth and nail unsuccessfully. And then the insurgents planned a huge attack uh, on their way, basically on their way out. So that's the movie. What does the movie get right? Just the heroics. My understanding is, and I can't prove it, but it does seem like there's some support for the claim that this is the most decorated battle, most stars, most awards in the Afghan war. And I'll talk more about that later. Um, I do check stuff that I think I have right on the internet, and the internet and AI doesn't always get it right. Like there's a very sad, dog shooting in the movie, and the internet says it didn't really happen. The character that does it, I don't think is real, but it does happen. I think actually on more than one occasion where they've befriended or, taken in some stray dogs, and the soldiers love having them around, but they'll just randomly attack a local that walks up to say hi or is in a discussion with them. And basically to make the peace, I hate to say it, they shoot the dog. So that did happen in the book, even though the internet says it didn't. It did happen in the movie, more than I think the movie actually displays. Another thing that they got right, these medics were unbelievable. We'll talk about the deaths versus the casualties. We'll talk about the impact on emergency medical services that I was trained in as a firefighter and EMT, and how they were impacted by these wars. The soldiers that they actually kept alive, given their injuries, is really unbelievable in hindsight. And there's one scene where they do a person-to-person blood transfusions, a buddy-to-buddy, and they did that. And it's so basically they couldn't keep blood at the outpost because they didn't have refrigeration. So they just had fluids, right, to keep blood pressure up. But sometimes eventually you lose so much blood, you have to have blood. And there's a risk involved. You have to make sure you have the right blood type and stuff. But in the movie anyway, the patient's A positive, the medic is A positive, and he hooks himself up and he's delivering blood directly to the patient. I think in the story, they actually had other soldiers kind of rolling through and continuing that process, which is just amazing. What they get wrong? Not much. They really just left out the politics. It feels like a little bit of a politically correct movie, although there are scenes where soldiers summarize all the weaknesses of the location. Just like the last two movies, there'll be one line of dialogue that's just loaded with information. In one scene, Scott Eastwood's character is on patrol and they're up in a mountain looking down at the base. And in one line, he just summarizes all the flaws and all the reasons for their headaches involving the location of this base at the bottom of a valley. They changed the name of one leader to Broward. If you watch the movie, there is a real character. He wasn't favorably portrayed in the book. He was portrayed as maybe a little weak. Maybe that's why, just to protect his name. I don't know, but that character is real, but the name was changed. One of the criticisms with this character and the real person surrounded the rules of engagement. That every time someone was out on the line or on patrol, they'd say, "Oh, I see somebody." They would need approval to open fire. And this particular commander would say, "Do you see a gun?" And if they didn't see a gun, he'd say, "You can't engage. And so that frustrated him. Also, at least in the movie, this particular commander really never left the hut. What they leave out, that opening helicopter crash that killed 10 people and all the, man, I hate to say, just inane casualties that took place in the first 500 pages of the book. Just waiting before this battle even started. I don't know how the movie was already over 2 hours long, but that is just, I'm just saying, if you read the book, you just, heartbreaking losses and casualties. A cool thing they left out, they built a radio station broadcast for locals consumption, talking about the latest good works that the U.S. was doing. Kind of reminded me of, in Vietnam, there was Hanoi Hannah. She was doing the opposite, right? She was telling U.S. soldiers it's futile, go home. But there was also a U.S. military radio kind of combating their messaging. And the same thing happened here. The other side was trying to broadcast messages to the locals about how evil the Americans were. I thought that was super interesting. There's another weird part of the story. It's very, very tiny. Really didn't even, I don't think it took place at Camp Keating, but it was one of the other combat outposts nearby. And if you looked at a map, they're surprisingly close to each other, even though it could take a long time for, say, a Black Hawk to get from one base to another, or God forbid, a truck, which they stopped trying. But there was this guy named Bo Bergdahl. He was a soldier out there in the Paktika province, I think it's called, and he just angrily walked off the base one day, and he was captured by the Taliban. There was an air search that took up resources that were meant for combat outpost Keating. He was held captive for like 5 years until 2014. He was released in a prisoner exchange with the Taliban. He was tried and convicted of desertion, which was overturned years later, diagnosed with some form of schizophrenia. But it's just I don't know, a little part of the story that might have been interesting to have shared and caused people to leave the theater and go home and look stuff up. What else? No, the conclusion of one unnamed general that the author quotes was saying at the end, it's too easy for the U.S. to use force. There are not enough domestic constraints, kind of looking back on the tragedy that was this effort, at least in the northeastern corner of Afghanistan, but other places as well. And it reminded me of the view that Noam Chomsky used to view, where he wanted to bring back the draft for the military, conscription, as a potential deterrent to this obsession with going to war, right? His argument is that, an all-volunteer professional army allows a detached government to wage these, in Noam Chomsky's words, brutal colonial wars without public opposition. Whereas if you had a citizens' army, that would ensure that the societal attitudes, as he said, are reflected in the military engagement, as you saw in the second half of the Vietnam War and with the protests. Again, as a firefighter and an EMT, when I was going through the EMT training, we learned a lot about how emergency medical response evolved from these two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. Rapid hemorrhage control, including tourniquets, clotting agents, those advanced blood transfusions, and this concept. It's in the book. I don't think they use the term in the movie, called the golden hour for trauma. Basically, if you can get certain levels of care to a patient within the first 60 minutes after the injury, it has a monumental impact positively on the survival rate. Exceedingly difficult to do at this outpost because helicopters couldn't get in, or they refused to come in. It was just so dangerous. They were just sitting ducks. There was only a couple places you could put the bird in this little valley, and you knew there were insurgents up in the hills pretty high up with RPGs just waiting for you to try that. So, but that's another takeaway, a reflection I had after reading the book and watching the movie. In summary, the war lasted 20 years. Casualties, I'm rounding, 2,500 U.S. dead, 21,000 wounded in action. And going back to that last story I talked about, EMS, I just can't imagine, without the skill and the courage and the commitment of all those medics out there in the middle of a firefight, what that ratio could have looked like, the dead versus the wounded in action. But again, some of these survivors, I mean, they're lost limbs, eyes, body parts, but they lived. It's just it's equally parts horrific and amazing to consider. So the Battle of Combat Outpost Keating, portrayed in the movie and at the end of the book, was considered one of the most decorated engagements in the war of Afghanistan. I don't know if anyone's actually done the total and declared that to be the case, but I have seen it in a couple places in my research. Multiple bronze stars, multiple silver stars, 27 Purple Hearts, and a couple of medals of honor. So this movie is still available on a couple of streaming services for $2 or $3, and it's worth watching because they did a great job showing just how horrific the experience was for the soldiers at Camp Keating, and yet how heroic everybody responded in the face of the opposition, which, again, they were vastly outnumbered. Their positioning was terrible. They kept running out of ammo. They couldn't get helicopters in when they needed it, and they fought for survival and fought valiantly. So Little shorter episode this time. Not much else to talk about, but I'll try to find something else to do besides war movies and books next week. Thanks for coming.